My guests today are Carol Gould, who is a philosopher, and David Gilmour, the legendary guitar player of Pink Floyd. Oh, sorry, Dave couldn't make it. Said the lookalike, Ian Williams,
It's the hair. It's the hair. It's a giveaway.
who is a scientist and an artist. So we're going to talk about Pink Floyd today. So I want to sort of rewind time back. Ian, so you were 60 miles of sort of the center of gravity of music in the mid 60s, so to speak.
Yeah.
There are two artists from that area, three artists, Roger Waters, David Gilmour, and Mark Knopfler, that I follow. And they came from that area. So what was happening, you think, in London in that time, in the mid 60s? Historically, I know that you didn't live there, but was there something sort of going on in that area that made all this, incredibly talented musicians?
Yeah. Well, I have a couple of thoughts on that. Clearly, the 60s was a time of great revolution, and particularly in England. I think it's also true in America, but certainly in England at the time, one of the sort of spears of that was music, for sure. And so I think a lot of very talented people and musicians migrated to London, and that musical scene at the time, even though London's a huge place, caused a sort of a focus of talent and young people coming in. And also, particularly, even if you look at the Rolling Stones and a number of other groups, they often started from being at school together or university together, and then formed these garage bands and gradually pulled people in. I think a lot of what one sees in music from that time reflects the social changes, the revolutions of the 60s,
Yeah.
and I think that's probably why we see such a creative output at that time. And interesting analogy, if you look at various other musical strains like punk rock or things, they've often started, a lot of them have started in England, a lot of them have started in London, a lot of them have started in response to social changes, whether it's political governments with which people disagreed, causing them to channel their energies into a new kind of music. So that would be my sense, such as it is.
So it's sort of the environment was right in some sense for this type of music to emerge, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
would you say that is true?
Yeah, I think with regard to Pink Floyd, and I may be wrong here, and I'd be interested in both of your thoughts, but it was viewed very much at the time, or it was most often played um, in college and university settings. You didn't tend to hear it in clubs or quote discotheques or things like that. It was very much the sort of thing where you'd sit in a room, smoke dope, and listen to Pink Floyd, and think you were, going out on you were just, wherever. And then I feel with Pink Floyd, they became, I think it's really true with Dark Side of the Moon. They then sort of broke through that fairly esoteric, they were making soundtracks for Last Year in Marianne Bad and, pretty esoteric stuff that your average person in the street wouldn't know too much about. But then they managed to break through and become really popular with Dark Side of the Moon. Now, one could argue whether is that really an impressive piece of work relative to the other things, such as Metal, Sorcerer's Secrets, things like that, which are not so commercial. After that, they seem to have combined both somehow. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So yeah, that
So Carol, I want to ask you. So you say you're sort of a recent convert into David Gilmour's guitar playing. So when did you first know David Gilmour?
Well, I had heard him. Of course, I had listened to him because one of my close friends is a huge fan of Pink Floyd. I mean, she said they speak to me. But I was listening to him as a musician, just, in terms of the pure sound. And I must confess, I hadn't paid as much attention to him, although, I never went to their concerts or anything like that. But after you told me of your intense passion for him, I started listening to him, and I found that there was great complexity in his playing, and in the Pink Floyd sound, I guess you would say. And then I started looking at the lyrics. I mean, I listening to the lyrics and looking at them and seeing a bit more about them. And one thing that I noticed about Gilmour was that it's very intense when he plays. And, very intense. And he's not focused so much outward on the audience. I mean, you can tell. So to me, that's very much part of, he's really creating sound. He's listening to his own sound. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And he has a very special timbre or, tone color. And he achieves things that I think, this is not my area of specialization, although I do a bit on philosophy of music and so forth. And I've listened to a lot of classical guitar, but to me, he's just as interesting, is the finest in that genre as well. I think there's something kind of jazzy about him too, about his music. And that's one of the things that I noticed. And of course, his lyrics are quite universal, as we've discussed a bit. And they speak to, I think, people's very deep feelings. I think what they speak to are anxieties too, and I think that there is something compelling about that, because as a lyricist, first of all, as a lyricist, or whoever wrote the lyrics, I know he wrote some, and actually, no, I think his wife wrote some of the lyrics for his later ones, yeah. But
since 1993, so Paula Samson, who is David Gilmour's second wife, wrote many of the lyrics, which is actually a recent information for me. I thought David wrote all of his lyrics because Paula wanted to sort of be anonymous because she didn't want to be seen as writing Pink Floyd lyrics, because there were some really good lyric writers before her. So Paula Samson, David Gilmour's second wife, wrote most of the lyrics after 1993.
I see. Well, to me, they're very introspective. The fact that he talks about alienation, he talks about, the human condition of aloneness. And I think that that's compelling. But what I found interesting was that when he plays, he's very introspective too. I don't see him, he's not a showman. He doesn't strike me as one. Am I right? Or I think that he's very focused on his music, his instrument. I've watched carefully a number of the YouTubes of their concerts, and I found that an intriguing aspect of him, especially for these, for many of these bands, where they do perform. I mean, if you compare him to someone like Mick Jagger or any of the Beatles, I guess, or whoever, or maybe Eric Clapton, who's also very good, but he just seems to be so involved and in such rapt concentration on the sounds that he's creating, and some of it I think is improvised, especially.
Let's rewind time just a bit. So
yeah.
Pink Floyd, so this is why I think Ian's perspective will be quite interesting. Started in 1965 with four guys: Sid Barrett, Roger Waters, Nick Mason, and Rick Wright. And three of these guys actually went to an architecture school in London. And they sort of started off like a pop band. So Ian, when you were frequenting all those clubs in central London, these guys were playing there in the mid '60s. And I have to say, I'm a huge Pink Floyd fan, but I have to say I didn't really, in retrospect, I don't like any of the early stuff that the band produced. I don't know if you had any exposure to that, Ian.
Oh yeah, I had a lot of exposure to, well, Piper at the Gates of Dawn and The Saucer Full of Secrets. I think those are probably one of the first two, right? I think.
Yeah.
The film Last Year in Marienbad, they played the music for that. And when I was at college, we always used to go to this strange cinema that played all the weird esoteric stuff. And there's nothing like going to see some film nobody's heard about, nobody understands. And then there's this music there, and of course it just, what can you say? It's sort of like an affectation, whatever you call it. It just was instantly cool, regardless of how the music necessarily landed on you. It was just something about it that was different from everything else that was going on. And as I say, it had this sort of feeling of something that was a little more difficult to access, not for the ordinary person. And I don't mean that to sound snobbish or aloofist or any of those things. It just had that feel to it, And although, having said all of that, it would be very unusual to go to a club or a party and hear any of their music until pretty much maybe Atom Heart Mother. Which came first, Atom Heart Mother or Metal? I forget. Atom Heart Mother, maybe. And
Atom Heart Mother came much later. So you had, as you mentioned, the Piper at the Gates of Dawn, the Source Full of Secrets, and Gilmour said something called More, which is it's a movie track.
Okay.
Which is fantastic music too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but as I was an undergraduate and I would go to friends' rooms, then often there would be Pink Floyd playing. I mean, that was a sort of a sign of coolness. You're a sort of okay person. If you have it going, it was that sort of thing. Yeah. So I think it was. They were viewed as something very different. It felt that the quality of the music. I'm not a musician, so I can't really speak to the complexity of it or the originality, other than that it sounded very different, and the lyrics were interesting and not the usual thing. I say the usual thing, the sort of thing the Stones and the Beatles were playing, which is sort of the perennial, love, separation, journey kind of stuff, So, yeah.
Yeah, so Carol, you might get bored with this conversation. So
no, not at all. I'm fascinated,
so when Ian was, sort of seeing them, so to speak, I was in South India. With a shortwave radio.
Yeah.
And this is quite interesting, Ian. I don't know if you remember, 1971 was, there was a series, cricket series between India and England. And there was a 3-test series, and they played at Lord's, they played at Old Trafford, and both were draws, and then they played Oval.
The Oval, yeah.
And then, so this is the first cricket series that India won in England, after being down 100 runs or so in the first innings. So 1971, I was sitting across the table from my grandfather, who used to play BBC all the time, and this was a massive thing, for India.
Of course.
And BBC commentators, as you know, very, very neutral. It's almost like they were joyous that India won.
Yeah, really.
And I was sitting there listening to these guys, and then some sort of music came in between those conversations, and that was my first sort of introduction to Pink Floyd. And
really, they had Pink Floyd in the test series, really, in between.
Yeah, so in between, in between the station identification or whatever.
Yeah.
That's probably the first time I heard Pink Floyd, and so 1971. The Dark Side of the Moon is still not there. It was, still there.
Yeah, that was 72.
72. Yeah. Right. And so, for whatever reason, I just like the sound of it. And as a little kid in India with no exposure to any sort of Western music, and so that was sort of an interesting concept.
This is new information. I mean, I wonder if anything that had been played in between you sitting there with your grandfather, listening to India beat England for the first time, would have been magnificent. We would now be discussing, I don't know, it could be anything, So it's a strange sort of concordance of things. Not to say that it isn't brilliant in and of itself and you wouldn't have come to it, but that's pretty special. Yeah?
It's
very special. Yeah. Go ahead, Carol, sorry.
Oh, no, I was going to say, though, that there might have been something. I think the Gill, and it's purely speculative, and I'm not speaking as a specialist in this, but there is something, I think, in some of their music that would resonate with someone whose ear had been trained to hear Indian music. I see some similarities there. And what they were, and I'm saying this because, one of the things about David Gilmour that I was really impressed with, in fact, blown away by, is his facility in the highest registers and the way he gets to them, and the way he sort of divides intervals or take liberties with the conventions of musical intervals. I mean, to me, it was very interesting. And so I could see where that would resonate, because in Indian music, there are different sort of principles of keys and harmonies and intervals. I think that there's a kind of intricacy. So, I mean, this is just a speculation. I make these connections, but so I could see where that would be intriguing. But yeah, so to me, that there's a real deviation from anything that was going on, or most of what, I shouldn't say anything, but much of what was going on conventionally. And I'm not a scholar of music of that particular era, but I do know that, of course, listening to it, everyone knows about the 60s. And, here, at least in the States, I think the music was somewhat different because there was so much protest, the Vietnam War and so forth, and the very flamboyant political protests and sexual revolution and, the birth of identity politics and so forth. So I think that their music could only have been, would be unlikely to have been born in the States. And the people who were very big in, I guess, in the 60s, 70s, whatever, in the States, they were California. They tended to be California based. But one thing I did read about David Gilmour is that he he was influenced by a number of people. In fact, he said that you can't, you have to copy whatever you want. And he said he just copied, but what came out was totally different. And I think that that's partly because his sound, just the pure sound alone, has a personality. And
Yeah, so
it's
it's interesting, Carol, that so for instance, I was never musical. I didn't really understand music. I didn't really have too much to do with it. And so, so, and I had an interview with Paula Samson and David Gilmour, and I realized that lyric comes after music. So David Gilmour gives Polly, maybe 50 different tracks, and then Polly writes some lyric to it, to one of the tracks, right? I only listen to the lyrics. So there's sort of perhaps there are groups of people who understand music, and perhaps there are groups of less sophisticated people, let's call them, who understand lyrics, right? Because music doesn't really matter that much. Ian, do you have a view on this?
You asking me or
Yeah, I mean, so I'm making a grand statement, right? So
yeah, it is. It's not really true in the sense. So, for example, Elton John wrote all his music in response to the lyrics. So the lyrics were presented to him, and as a fait accompli. I forget the name of the guy who wrote them all now. But then Elton John just sat down and wrote this beautiful music to the lyric. Yeah. So it doesn't always work like that. And I mean, isn't this true of Mozart, Carol? That he often took librettos and then wrote the music.
yeah,
Okay.
and there's a whole tradition, of Lieder in say the 19th century, the Romantic period, where they would make music based on poetry,
Right.
or the songs would be written to accompany poetry or something, or or a folk song. I mean, I think that yeah. So I think though that what's interesting here is that in David Gilmour's case, the music preceded the lyrics. So for Gilmour, it was the music
Right.
that he started with. It was
Yeah.
That was at the foundation of it, and that preceded what he was saying. He was speaking musically
Right.
first, and
In,
hypothesis.
in the
yeah,
interview, Gill, that you referred to, was there any statement as to whether Gilmour modified the lyrics, or did he just? So he gave various pieces of music, and she sort of took one and wrote some lyrics, and he just took them, or did he say, well, that's not what my music is? That'd be very interesting to know.
No, they apparently, and I didn't know a lot about this, apparently work very well together, and she understands him.
Yeah.
And so, if you get a collaboration like that, you can make beautiful music. And since 1993, Gilmour has made really interesting music, I would say. Rattle the Rock is, I think, 2014, which is just a phenomenal thing. And so again, rewinding time back a little bit. So Sid and Roger Waters sort of grew up in Cambridge. They go to architecture school. They get together. They always had a dream of creating a group before they went to London. And they meet Nick and Rick, and they start a group. And I listened to some of their earlier stuff. I don't get it. It's so bad. I can't even imagine that is music. but then it seems to have gotten some traction, right? And then, interestingly, Sid Barrett went into Roger Waters says he was schizophrenic and went on drugs and all of that. But whatever the reason is, he became less effective. And then David Gilmour joined the band.
Right.
And things seem to have really taken off from there. These four guys seems to have created some beautiful music since then.
They did hold Sid in tremendous respect. I mean, "Shine On You Crazy Diamond," I think, is about Sid, right? And his genius, I guess. But it seems like he did just lose it, whether he was actually schizophrenic. Which is a very sad story. But hey, these things happen. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, the early stuff, yeah, perhaps that's true of a lot of creative. When you're coming together and trying things out, seldom does it just, all come. So I don't know, but that's so peculiar, perhaps. Yeah.
One thing that's interesting about Gilmour is I don't think he studied music.
No.
He started studies. I don't think he finished them, but he was in languages, modern languages or something. So he didn't have that kind of background. But he had been playing since he was very young, and he was experimenting with electrical guitars and different types, and so he was thinking about it. There were things percolating, as it were.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point, Carol, that studying music might be a death knell let me make a grand statement and we can
That sounds a very Eapen-like statement.
a death knell to innovation. So see, go out to university and I study economics, and I say, I can do all these regressions and I'm going to make some stuff up. But I won't find anything. And music is the same way. If you go out and study music, your chance of making something interesting is substantially lowered.
Well, I would disagree with that, Gill, and I'll tell you why. Because some of the most innovative experimental musicians were highly educated, highly trained, like Leonard Bernstein, Debussy. I mean, they had to know the principles in order to violate them and change them and experiment. So I think I think it can go either way. And it depends also on the genre. And there are people these fabulous singers who have voices that sound trained that aren't. And sometimes, in fact, I think I know what you're saying, because I was listening to some Gershwin pieces the other day. They happened to come up on my YouTube feed for God knows what reason. And I listened to some of the classically trained artists who were singing it. It was awful. I mean, I couldn't listen. I thought, this is not what he wanted. This is, it's not the right kind of jazz. And then, I listened to some other people who were more like club scene people or jazz musicians, and it was fantastic. Although Gershwin himself, of course, was highly, a finely trained musician. But what I wondered is, when you interviewed David Gilmour and Polly, what did they have to say about, his inspiration for his sound? And is he aware of the uniqueness of his sound and some of the extraordinary things that people hear when they're just listening to the music itself?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously didn't interview David Gilmour and Polly, but the stuff that I watched about them, and you said this, Carol, that David Gilmour is not a showman, at least from my perspective. He is performing. He's a musician. And his only goal when he performs is to make the best out of what he could perform. It's not quite true with Roger Waters, if you've seen him. And I've seen both of these guys in concert for a couple of dozen times,
Really?
all around the world. And Roger Waters is a performer. He performs for you. It's not just about music. It's about a message.
So
But
where do you think, I'm sorry, I was going to say, in coming on the performance aspects of it, that is often something people associate with Pink Floyd, is that it's a whole experience, particularly in their use of electronic sounds, but also just the plethora of percussion and different kinds of instruments that they use. And then, of course, it grows and grows and grows, and you've got inflatables and smoke and light shows, and a lot of people. But was a total experience. I wonder how you feel about that. Do you think that adds, subtracts, diverts? It's integral. What do you think?
Yeah, so Carol, I would love to get your perspective on this too. So when I saw Roger Waters in Hartford just 2-3 years ago, he's quite old now.
yeah.
And
Aren't we all?
he's singing beautiful. It was all about a show. We had Donald Trump pasted all around the wall. We had, it is really, it's like a show. It's not just music. It's a message. It's strong. It's clear. You have
It's a kind of opera, you might say. Yeah, there's a drama, there's there are lyrics, there's music, right? It's somewhat operatic in that way.
Yeah, and so Ian, I think I like it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I like the Pink Floyd show, and David Gilmour does it too. But as Cal was saying, when you look directly at him, he seems to be not a showman, right? He is basically inside himself trying to express. So he's a true artist. Whereas when you look at Roger, he's trying to tell you something.
Yeah.
He say, go create a revolution. Don't waste any time.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the themes that they're espousing and expanding on. My sense is it's very sort of, particularly in the light of Brexit, although they were much earlier, the criticism of the hanging on to the threads of empire, the capturing of the autocratic schools that they grew up in, that I grew up in, where the empire was still pasted on the wall, and all this crazy stuff, and they were, in my mind, they were sort of pushing against that. And that's something that I got quite strongly from the period that they were most influential for me, in that 70s, 80s period,
Yeah, I don't know, Carol, if you looked at, so Nick Mason and Rick Wright, who are, equal partners in this venture. And I, watched some of their, sort of feelings about Pink Floyd. And I think Nick Mason was saying, something like, with Roger, it's all about school and wars.
Yeah, that's right.
It has been school and wars, right? Yeah. And at some point, these guys said, "Okay, so we did that.
We've done that, yeah. Now
let's go do something else." And Roger wasn't, into anything other than that.
Yeah.
And so if you look at the divergence in 1985 between David Gilmour and Roger Waters, Roger was still telling you, revolution is needed. Go do something. Right. Don't just sit back on your sofa, watch Fox TV. So what he's trying to tell you.
So what do you think Gilmour is saying after that, when he sort of broke out? Because I haven't listened to that so much, and I don't have a good sense if there's what themes do you pick up? Are they all over the place, or does he have a strong message, or is it more more about the inherent quality of the music, and you make of it what you will.
Yeah, I saw a recent one with David Gilmour in Brazil, and I was really surprised by this statement. So he was saying something like, "Yeah, the Muslim world, uh, they're angry, and that's because the Western world didn't really do the right things. But you say it's not a big deal. You say they'll get over it, and things are, you know, going to be okay in the future." I like the optimism around.
Yeah.
But it also tells you, sort of his state of mind. It's basically saying, yeah, let's not shout revolution all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take the status quo as they appear to be and give it some time. Sometimes, time heals a lot of wounds.
Well, I mean, Gilmour is very involved. I don't know if this is at all relevant, but he's so involved in different social causes, Oxfam and so forth. And I think he has a very profound sense of, social justice, responsibility, and so forth. But one thing that I did see at Waters, I was reading about their concert in Pompeii. I actually watched a good bit of that. And there wasn't an audience, but apparently Waters had a great influence towards the audience, had a lot of anger. And he would sometimes turn his back on the audience, that they were making all this noise and they were coming to hear him, to hear them, and yet so I wonder, so it was that even part of the performance, being annoyed that there wasn't enough, that they were paying attention, but the kind of hate for being on him that he wanted.
It's very hard to hear you, Carol. Are you having trouble, Gill?
Oh. No?
Okay, we can hear you now.
Oh, okay. I wonder what happened.
It was sort of like last time. There was this strange sort of, I don't know, so white noise. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
So
I was just hoping it's not the sound of another condominium coming down in Florida.
Oh, God.
No, please.
Yeah, well, I should move to Connecticut.
No, so
too much happens.
So these guys, they had a breakout moment. So Ian, I don't know if you remember, The Dark Side of the Moon came out in 1973. And I clearly remember when I heard it on BBC for the first time, probably maybe 3 months after it was released or something like that. Do you have a memory of when you heard it first time?
Oh God, yes, absolutely. I had a very good. I was in my first year undergraduate, and I was in a friend's room, and this friend, he worked at a bakery in summer, so he had money, and he had a wonderful stereo system. The whole thing, the deck, the big speakers, and he had a large room, and he said, "I've just got it. And it was a brilliant summer's day outside, and his room was quite dark, and he played this, and from those opening, and it was a chord or a note, that dong, and it was just transformative. I mean, so I remember that so clearly, and then you just couldn't get away from it. I mean, it was just everywhere in the university halls of residence where I spent my first year. So yeah, that was my first experience of it, and I thought, the whole thing about money. But what I was really taken with is their hallmark, how they will fade a sound out and turn it into the beginning of the next song.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just sort of so well done on that in so many ways, and it felt like it was a complete entity, It wasn't a series of individual tracks.
It was sort of a revolution of the thematic music. There's sort of a different category almost. So Dark Side of the Moon made thematic music quite interesting. So Cal, from a philosophical perspective, this is where I think music became philosophy. Yeah, with Pink Floyd. Yeah.
I mean, it's very existential. And I think that's one reason why it's probably, I think, just historically the best-selling album in the world.
Yeah, I didn't know that. It's true, yeah.
And in fact, if a friend of mine told me this a while ago about Pink Floyd, because she's a fanatical. She said to me, this album is so good. She was listening to it once when I called, and she said that, do you know that they've had to take it out of the running because it's always at the top and it so outpaces everything else that they don't even count it anymore. And it is an extraordinary work, and it's the lyrics I can see, but I do think that it is philosophy. I think it's philosophy in many ways. I think in terms of its point of creation historically, because they were quite excited about, the man walking on there was a man who walked on the moon. I mean, and it wasn't the dark side of the moon was sort of about that. I mean, and you get this, even the title is so beautiful. It's so evocative. But I do think that it does touch upon some large themes about, human anxiety, human limitations, alienation, so forth. That's just my untutored point of view.
Yeah, so, I saw David Gilmour saying that they were in BBC studios, I don't know, it was Radio 6 or something like that, when actually, when people were walking on the moon. They were doing a live record, live thing on BBC Radio. There are millions of people listening to Dark Side of the Moon when there were actual people walking on the moon and not able to see it, which is an incredible thing. But my favorite album remains to be "Wish You Were Here," and it was created by. It was written by Roger Waters. I think it's a lot about it is Sid Barrett. Their sort of the founder who became mentally ill and by then had left.
Yeah, that was such a sad story because I think that that was from an overdose or something, and his brain was so badly injured.
Yeah. So, Carol, do you have a favorite album so far? The ones that you listened to so far?
The ones that I've listened to so far, well, I like The Dark Side of the Moon, and I think that the Wish You Were Here, there is that, when you know the story behind it and so forth, but I think in terms of the music, but Wish You Were Here has that poignancy. I think that that's a universal theme too, because, and actually it has this wonderful, poetic layers of meaning to it. Wish you were here. Human beings are isolated. Death happens, things. But the point to it, like a gospel undercurrent, and there's a confessional element to it. It's very appealing. So far, I may change my mindset. whether that, but
Yeah. So Ian, so what do you think? Do you have a favorite album of Pink Floyd?
I find it difficult to choose between "Wish You Were Here," "Dark Side of the Moon." I do like "Echoes," which is really a side, I suppose. It's half an album.
Yeah.
I found that had quite an effect on me, I must say, both in terms of a combination of the what you call the electronic effects that are so well done there. I suppose the whole Soviet Cold War era nuclear submarine pinging, the whole thing. It just came as it does. I was at a very impressionable age, which brings me back to a question I wanted to circle back to. As you mentioned, Carol, and I didn't know this till I was reading about this, that it's the world's top-selling album, Dark Side of the Moon. It would be interesting to look at the demographics of who's buying it and why. So if we had some 16, 17, 18-year-olds, I mean, presumably they're buying it, right? I mean, we've already got it. I mean, right? I suppose it could be going out now into parts of the world where it didn't make it before, or is it now down in generations,
So it says, Ian, 45 million copies sold.
Yeah.
I remember sitting in Hartford, Roger Waters' concert, and there was a 22-year-old on my right side and a 24-year-old on my left side. And I was thinking, this is really transformational. It transcends age.
Yeah. I wonder how they came to it and what they see in it and whether it's different from what we see.
Must be, no?
I suppose so. But you'll be an interesting example, Carol, because, well, when did you first encounter it?
Well, I had
heard music, I guess.
Heard it, but I guess that I hadn't really focused on it until fairly recently. Actually, when Gill, the first time Gill wrote to me, I thought, yeah, that guy's a good guitarist. And I know, I had a couple of friends who were classical guitarists, very, highly trained, who loved him, and also Clapton and people like that. But they talked about him, so I listened to them. I mean, this would be maybe that I was so because of my own physical studies have probably ruined me, Gill.
But you're an interesting example of somebody who comes to it later in life from a musical background. And it's interesting to hear how it lands on you,
Yeah.
And I'm interested to know just like who's buying it and how do they get there? Is it like their parents, which is usually the last thing that influences a young person's? It would be like, but it's sort of an interesting question. And what it feels perhaps a little bit. I mean, are the themes that they're talking about, that we've been talking about, are they appealing to the youth today? Are they just constant themes?
Constant themes.
Yeah.
So I'll give you some insights into this, Ian. So my daughter.
Yeah, I was going to ask what you were doing.
Yeah, I obviously probably biased her views. She likes David Gilmour. From what I understand, she doesn't particularly like Roger Waters. And so that's actually an important insight, which is it's a young generation gravitating toward sort of the David Gilmour-esque music. I mean, Roger Waters always had a lot to say. He, like I said, he's always trying to start a revolution. He's impatient. He's saying that this stuff doesn't work. Go do something about it.
Yeah.
Whereas David is more about music. And so I think you have to differentiate so when you ask, what actually makes the young generation sort of gravitate toward this old stuff, there's two different old stuff there. It looks to me.
But Dark Side of the Moon is a constant in that it sells, right? I mean, that was probably still. How would you describe Dark Side of the Moon in terms of a Gilmour, Waters? Is it a synthesis of their skills and styles, or is it a start of something moving one way, more towards Gilmour, perhaps?
Yeah, so Dark Side of the Moon for me, the lyrics are all written by Roger Waters.
Yeah.
And most of the sort of the guitar work, it's all done by David Gilmour. And so then again, there's a combination of, do you create music and then makes lyrics to it? Do you create lyrics and make music to it? I don't know exactly how they did that.
Right.
It's a huge technical accomplishment. We're talking about 1973.
Yeah.
And at that time, it was impossible to create something like this. And so they all seem to have seen, so they say Nick and Rick and everybody else say it's the only album they actually worked together so well.
Yeah.
That everything sort of came together, congealed, and made something happen. By the time they got to Wish You Were Here, things were starting to break apart.
Yeah, fray at the edges. It would be interesting to know if they had some audio engineer who was able, whether they said this is what we want to do, because they don't have those skills, right? I don't think, and it is very sophisticated for the time. Maybe that's just too much technical detail. I mean,
I think these kids actually they actually invented, in the way I understand it, some of the technical stuff by themselves.
Wow.
So it wasn't, sort of Microsoft dropping in and doing stuff for them. It's actually,
Yeah, right. That's right.
Yeah.
Gil, if I may ask, what does your daughter like about David Gilmour? Why does she like Gilmour better than?
So, I mean, Ian probably can explain this. I think, for the younger generation, maybe Roger Waters is a bit too rough. I don't know if it's the right term.
Could be.
David Gilmour is,
Namby-pamby.
Yeah, much more sophisticated. So I have to say, from my perspective, I like Roger Waters a lot, actually.
I do too.
I like what he's trying, to express, because lyrics is actually more important for me than music. So I think that's probably the distinction. If you look at the David Gilmour album, it's beautiful music with good lyrics. Look at Roger Waters thing. It's mostly lyric. It's shouting at you, say, things are not working. Go do something about it. And then some music, right? And so I sort of gravitate toward the latter. I don't know if you answered your question, Carol.
I mean, if that's the case, I mean, you don't need that musical aspect of it, because so I think you're responding to something else. You must. I mean, you wouldn't need to hear it in the context of a song, and maybe do something that music that engraves it more deeply into your soul, and somehow makes you experience those words in a different way. And if it were different music with the same lyrics, it would not. That's what I think. I think that the music, even subliminally, you may not be paying attention to it. Subliminally, it's affecting your attention to the music. I mean, to the lyrics, sorry. The music lyrics.
Yeah, I think that is true. And so if you want to make a sort of a differentiation between David Gilmour and Roger Waters, we can look at 1985. So the Wall was an exceptionally successful album. They made the final cut in 1983. And then by 1985, in spite of all the philosophy that they were talking about, they couldn't get along.
Can you hear me?
I can, yeah. Can you hear us, Ian? Ian, can you hear us?
You both.
So let's.
Hello, Gill.
Let's stop the session and let me send you another link. And let's. Can you hear us now, Ian?
Yes, I can. You both froze.
Yeah. We are intermittently freezing, or whatever reason. I think the internet is broken. And so what I was saying, Ian, was that if you look at 1985, there was this big, sort of split, and then Roger Waters went on and did his thing, and Gilmour, Nick, and Rick did their thing. There's a beautiful album in 1987, The Momentary Lapse of Reason. I don't know, Carol, if you had a chance to listen to that.
Not that one, no.
Yeah, so The Momentary Lapse of Reason, is true David Gilmour. It's David Gilmour minus Pink Floyd, so to speak. All the anger has been removed, and all the music has been added back. Yeah. And then you see, it's sort of a different. So a lot of the, the real sort of old Pink Floyd fans don't like it because there is a lot of anger in it. It's beautiful music, just David Gilmour doing guitar and singing. And then Division Bell came along in 1994. And that is another beautiful album. And again, the hardcore Pink Floyd guys don't like it because it doesn't have Roger Waters in it.
I may have heard part of that, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but then, Roger Waters went on and did a bunch of interesting things on himself, which was really angry, It's like taking David Gilmour out of Pink Floyd, and only anger remains now. And it was also good. I remember seeing Roger Waters in Milwaukee in 1987, 2 years after I landed in Chicago. This was my objective, to go see Roger Waters in Milwaukee. And, I don't have the details, but the pros and cons of hitchhiking, Radio Chaos. I don't know if you guys know these albums.
No, I
but
don't.
They're beautiful albums in themselves. And so, we have a talented group of people together doing very, very interesting stuff, but they couldn't stay together. They went off in different directions and produced really, really interesting stuff on their own.
Do you miss the synthesis then between the you keep using the word anger, the call to revolution combined with the musicality? If that sort of splits apart, do you think each has lost something as a result of that?
So David Gilmour for me is a true musician. Music. He makes music. He makes beautiful music. Roger Waters would rather have a revolution, right? And he's good at that too, I like both of these guys. So when I listen to Roger Waters, I want to create a revolution myself.
I wonder if he's more effective by having, this is too strong a statement, but having the sort of the beautiful music stripped away or pushed more to the background. And it would be interesting to look at the relative sales of the two. I don't know, there's some metrics of who's buying it and why, but
let's go back to 1960s, mid 60s. So go back to London again.
Yeah.
And what these kids were, so, Beatles were on 3 Abbey Road, they were on 6 Abbey Road, they were actually recording things together. When Beatles were recording things, they were recording things. And these kids actually, they always had something to say. It's not like just pop music,
No. There was a message. There was a reason.
Always seen a message. Yeah.
Well, it was a huge rebellion. It was, as we talked about, it was a sexual revolution. It was a break with I think in England, still at that sort of old empire stuffiness. The 50s, there was still rationing. I mean, all this thing, and it was sort of now blossoming, and it was just an opportunity. Paris, they were tearing up the streets. I mean, here, well, I suppose the equivalent would have been, as Carol said, the war, and that engendered a lot of music, I think. So, yeah, I think that's really, and again, London was the place, because unlike now, where you can create this stuff almost anywhere, you need to have the musicians, the engineers, the money, the studios, all of those things were in London, right? So that isn't too surprising why they would all come there.
From an American perspective, Carol, from an American perspective, what is your sense that, Beatles have been enormously successful in the US? When Pink Floyd came to California for the first time, they were not really that successful. Right. In fact, I don't know if Pink Floyd were, I don't know this, but, so from a concert perspective, were that successful till Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here came out, and a lot of people started listening to it.
That's right. That was the success, yeah.
That was a success, yeah.
I mean, they weren't on the, what was it, the Ed Harris show? What was the Ed Sullivan show? I mean, when the Beatles made the Ed Sullivan show, then that just sort of gave them that. But they were accessible. They were easily accessible. They were kind of cute, different, long-haired, British over here, I mean, the whole thing was very different from these fairly esoteric, kind of little bit trippy, weird people coming out with this pretty sophisticated kind of music, not 3-minute songs of I Want to Hold Your Hand, so it's a very different.
Right. It wasn't, it was, I mean, it took a little concentration. The Beatles, as you say, were accessible. And I think that, I could be wrong about this, but the Beatles attracted even a very young crowd, as well as an older crowd. I mean, that, I don't know how young, but like what, 11, 12?
Yeah, 11 and 12-year-olds were classic. Yeah, sure. Pictures you see. Hey, that's me.
What was happening then? I mean, because I think that one thing that was happening is that, there was this, they were beginning to emerge from the 1950s, which were very staid and stable. And they were looking at a very different world than kids today, teenagers today. In fact, I would not want to be a teenager today. I think, never thought I'd say that, but it's true. I mean, they do not have the kind of optimism. Who even thought about the kinds of things that kids today are thinking about? And, there's this kind of paradigm shift in education, both in the way it's delivered and the way it's in accessibility. I think that the class structure globally has changed. I mean, the class, I've mentioned this before, but I think that the wealth gap has created more social change than almost any other factor. But did kids who were coming out of the 1950s and early 60s, were they thinking about climate change? Things like that. And now, they were having good lives. They wanted to enhance them. Middle-class kids were having good lives. Things were stable. there wasn't the kind of, there was the nuclear family that seemed much more stable. And if you look at the sociological trends, that maybe 20% of, say, in America, American families fit the norm of the conventional nuclear family. So kids today, I mean, very gradually, I think there was this accumulation of anxiety, and I think that has a lot to do with that. And now we have something entirely new. I mean, it's in my experience, and I've been, college professor, so I've seen this change, where they're even questioning their gender identity and, tinkering with it. And that was simply, that wouldn't have been thought of in, I think, coming out of the 1950s, although there were people who were transsexual, but it was very secret.
So the interesting question, Carol, is that is music, there's a sort of broader sociological question, which is the type of music that Pink Floyd was creating, does it have a role to play in society today at the face of Facebook and Google and other social media channels? Because if you, again, go back to 1960s, this was sort of a statement to recruit, so to speak, right, the young crowd. Now you don't need music anymore. You just go to Facebook and then you put a bunch of crap there, and then a lot of people sign up for it. And so, is music really needed anymore?
I think music has always been needed. It's been in every human culture and society. It's been a mode of expression. So yes, and I mean, you hear a lot of, Facebook people post music. I don't post very often, but often when I do, it's something musical. But or something I've heard that I liked. Yeah. So, but I do think that the social media situation, which I think has become very dangerous, and now they have another source of anxiety, their identities are being compromised, and then we have the pandemic, which has further alienated individuals from one another, especially the last year. But yeah, I think that they still need music. I think it's important. It's a different experience. They experience it differently. I think that there's a lot of fascination with the period of the 60s, 70s, even 80s, precisely because that can't be replicated today. So
I wonder, Carol, though, yes, I agree that music is a balm for the soul and always will be. But if you think about the time when Pink Floyd came to stardom, there were universal platforms, whether it's, quote, the BBC, or there was a hit parade or whatever, and everybody had access. I don't think that's really the case. And there is a tremendous fractionation. So you like this particular kind of music, and you can find 5 million people who like that, but other people will have no clue what it is, So I wonder, it is an interesting issue. You've got the points that you mentioned, these amazing revolutions going on with social media, COVID, global warming, horrendous problems, which historically one would say would cry out for musical response, perhaps much like the 60s did, or the 20s did, or various times in human history where there was the ability to have music and to have it broadly disseminated. And now maybe there isn't an opportunity for music to offer that either call to arms or that balm or that interpretation.
Well, One thing that just occurred to me when you two were speaking is that if we look back at, and I'm speaking somewhat off the top of my head, but if you look back and people like Pink Floyd or some of the other Elvis, say, people who were doing amazingly new things to music or synthesizing things in new ways. This usually heralded some kind of change in society. It didn't necessarily cause it, but it was, I think, usually a sign that there was to be some kind of tectonic shift. And I think Pink Floyd was one of those signs, much more so than the Beatles.
So a leading indicator, sort of.
Pardon me?
Yeah, but there hasn't been any change, I would argue.
Has there been?
I would argue there hasn't been any change in society.
Since when? I mean, over what?
Since 1960s.
Which is a huge change.
So the larger question would be, has Pink Floyd caused any change in society? I would say no.
Well, I would agree with that.
Well, I would say that they're not causing it, but I would think that they're a kind of sign of it. If I think back at some of and even in classical music as well, where things that we think of as very old-fashioned were new at one time, they usually accompanied or were a sign of something new that was happening that wasn't yet at the surface of consciousness, that wasn't manifested widely in society, but something was happening in the zeitgeist. And I think that that's why, and then, someone like Pink Floyd bursting on the scene precedes this whole new, element of society, this whole new social behavior, social norms. Yeah, I think that music is a very, I never thought about it before, but actually it is a kind of way to see that, to signal that something is changing. When you have someone who's very innovative, I mean, why did they get away with it at that time?
I think perhaps what you're saying is it's sort of a leading indicator, but it's not a cause. And I was, as you were talking, I'm trying to think, has there ever been a case where a piece of music or a genre, I mean, did the blues cause a change? No, I think that was a reaction to the circumstance. Jazz, which broke out perhaps in the 20s, did that usher in a more sort of post-World War I, carefree, exuberant? I think it always either paralleled or, as you suggest, foretold, but I can't think of an instance where it actually caused change, that there was a rallying around. I mean, people will take pieces of music as an anthem, for their cause, but I'm not sure that there was ever a call to arms that people rushed out and, got a brick or voted differently.
Yeah, I think it's too inefficient to cause a change, because the utility that you get from listening to David Gilmour or Roger Waters is substantially higher than trying to attempt a change. And so it sort of gives you a cover in some sense. If you go to Roger Waters' concert, you're basically advertising your need to change the world, but then you go listen to the music and you come back and you sleep, and so it doesn't. It is sort of a fake idea. It just gives people a way to advertise. It's like buying a Tesla and parking it on your driveway, saying I'm an environmentally friendly car.
Sure.
So
well, there may be a case. I was thinking just about this last night. I was talking to some people at dinner, and I don't know. I'm sure you know this, Carol. They are So Verdi's Nabucco is an opera, and there's a chorus in there, Va Pensiero. Do you know this, Carol? Which Italians want to become their national anthem. And they have a national anthem, but it's just as dreary as apart from the Marseillaise, as everybody else's national anthem. But they want, and I experienced this. I went to a performance of Nabucco in Verona, and they did this chorus piece, and everybody jumped up and clapped and cheered, and so they did it 3 times, right? And so here was an example of a piece of music that sort of galvanized this is what it is to be Italian. This is a very national pride. Now, did that really? It's sort of producing a change. There's a big movement to adopt that as an anthem. So maybe there is case where, because music speaks to a different part of the brain, right? I mean, it stirs emotions and spirit that other things can't do.
Yeah, so I mean, we can test this. So we can go back and sort of empirically ask an empirical question. Has there been any case in the past where music actually caused a change to society, right? I can't really put my finger on it. I don't know if you guys...
Well, Beethoven, sorry. I was going to say, well, Beethoven, surely. I mean, he sort of ushered in the romantic... So is that just something that was capture it before it was really there?
He was responding to it. He was trying to, he brought it to attention, but he didn't cause it. But I was thinking about something that when Gill was talking about testing it, that if you think about the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, there are many cases of famous musicians, artists, and so forth who tried to affect the revolution through music. For example, one of the core values of the Soviet system was, that every art form should be accessible to everyone. So everything should be easy, as you were saying, Ian. You described the Beatles that way, or maybe Gill did. But that everything should be. And there were a couple of very famous composers who got into trouble, a lot of trouble, who were tormented and tortured, and and yet if they if they created authentically. When they created their music authentically, they were somehow willing to do it, but it didn't cause a revolution. It did in the musical world because it was disseminated into the West somehow, but that was not, it changed nothing. And it was just banned, and there were so many musicians sent to Siberia or worse. So I mean,
well, I wonder if, as you were talking there, I was thinking about that. So it's often said that people will point to Ulysses, The Wasteland, certain works of literature that harbored a whole new way of expressing oneself.
Right, yes.
And whilst you couldn't point to, that caused a revolution or a war or it sort of infiltrates all society, and then it probably does in that sense. And perhaps the same is true with music, even though it didn't necessarily, and I don't know what the diagnostic or the measurement you would want to see, Gill, that you could draw a line between music and a concrete occurrence. But if there is a change in a style of music that becomes broadly adopted and then disseminates through society, then that changes everyone's perceptions and actions.
Yeah, so let me advance another hypothesis here. And so one could argue that music could be a good segregation mechanism. So I go back to India, and different classes have different types of music. There's a high-end music. I don't know much about Indian music, but as you go down the classes, you have different artistic aspects, you have different music. So music could be a very nice way to segregate classes in society.
Well,
So question,
yeah, that's an interesting idea. I mean, it does with religious identity.
yes,
But does it segregate or diagnose?
I think it segregates. So like if you go to South India, for example, we can distinctly see the different classes of people. They have different types of music, different artistic forms, and so on. So it is sort of an icing on the cake, so to speak, of segregation. So then, in the Pink Floyd context, do we have something that sort of cuts through? Pink Floyd is not something the upper echelons of London would go and listen to. I would imagine, they would go to the opera houses. No?
Well, I don't know. I think you have no data, and B, if I just had to propose, I think they would. As I said earlier, I think from my experience, the people that were listening to Pink Floyd tended to be university educated as opposed to tradespeople or so-called blue-collar people or whatever. Much more so.
Right,
much
right.
more so. And
so
I
there's
think
sort of an intellectual segregation.
Yeah. Right. Now, so the question is it because it was perceived, it started amongst an intellectual group and therefore was perceived as such by, let's say, let's call them non-intellectuals? Or is it that there's something about the quality of the music, and this could apply equally well to literature, I suppose, or writing or any other art form, that is just not accessible to without a certain experiential background? I know this is very dangerous territory here, but it is fundamentally interesting. And or people.
It's a very important question. Yeah. I think it's a very important question. Yeah.
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind is this. There's a terrible. In the Royal Albert Hall in London, every year there is a prom concert. I don't know if either of you've ever heard about it, and it plays a lot of Elgar, which was very sort of martial, nationalistic empire, land of hope and glory. And all these people are there and they're waving, Union Jacks, and the whole thing is just appalling. But that really separates them, They would be prime Brexiters, keep England great, let's keep all people out who aren't like us, all that stuff. Yeah, I think it can be it can be sort of a badge in some sense, it's like wearing a credential of some kind.
And we have the same thing here in the US, Carol, right? I mean, there are musicians who go to Trump concerts and there are musicians who go to Biden concerts. And people like them differently.
Well, yeah. And I do think that globalization has played an interesting role in music, so that, you have a lot of, like Latin American music has definitely infiltrated the classical world, or maybe vice versa, which I love personally. I mean, classical, many, flamenco, for example, has become, many composers have worked with it. Many people have arranged music to work with, flamenco and traditional music or traditional classical music or tango. I mean, now some of the most important composers are recognized as some of the earlier tango composers. So, that I think is interesting, and I think that's true also. I mean, I think that the Beatles were trying to achieve that in when they went to India, and of course, actually, it was a British violinist. Well, no, I don't know what you'd call him. He was a cosmopolitan, but Yehudi Menuhin, a violinist who is of another generation. He was the teacher of a well-known current violinist named Daniel Hope. who he was the first classical musician to play with Indian musician, Ravi Shankar, the sitar, and that I think was, everybody knew about it, and it became, somehow it infiltrated not classical, pop music, because that's when, we started seeing these rock musicians migrating to, or making a pilgrimage to India to get enlightened and so forth. That, if I recall vaguely, not a scholar of the Beatles, sorry, but there was some album that had distinct Indian elements to it, and not so much other Asian, and also African. I think that some more recent musicians have adapted African music, or certain African, I mean, not that that's a monolithic entity or form.
Well,
because
I mean, Paul Simon would be a great example. He really did that very well.
That's right.
And you mentioned Yehudi Menuhin, and he also played a lot with Stefan Grappelli, who was a great jazz violinist. Right. So there is this sort of breaking out of genre, which amongst classical musicians, which is just interesting.
But he was unusual, and had he not been so well established as a classical musician, I don't think anyone would have been that impressed or interested in the fact that he was playing with Stefan Grappelli, who was a jazz violinist, or would they be interested in the fact that, so he used his stature in the music world to affect a change.
Mm-hmm.
Without a change.
But it's a change. Sorry.
Go ahead. You froze.
Frozen for a moment.
Can you hear us?
Will you speak? Yes, I can now. What did you say, Gill?
No. So, so in some sense, my hypothesis is that music is a very inefficient medium for creating a revolution. Nobody can write more distance. Maybe he doesn't know this.
Probably. Yeah.
So this has been great, Carol. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Thank you. I've loved it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.